It's because out and done. Even they are not even showing up to singles events. I came across this video and I was floored once again. But then again, it was like, what else is new? Because every time I look around, it is more evidence of men being done, men being checked out, women messing up. And the reason why I'm going to go ahead and say it is us women that are messing up is because we are the ones out here vocalizing our shallowness. Yes, I said it. Oh, I don't want to date him because he's under 6 feet. Oh, I don't want to date him because I don't like his shoes. Oh, I don't want to be with him because I don't like his wardrobe. You name it. And before you know it, men from all over say, you know what? Let me not even bother, because these women are looking for picture perfect men, and I don't meet that requirement. I don't. Unlike us, ladies, the men know how to be realistic.
There is a quiet shift happening beneath the noise of social media, beneath the arguments, beneath the headlines, and beneath the carefully curated narratives that people repeat without questioning. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, and it is not being announced with press releases or protests. It is something far more serious than that. It is men choosing absence over participation, silence over argument, peace over chaos, and distance over constant negotiation. If you have been paying attention, you already know what I'm talking about. And if you have not, then this video is going to explain why this shift is happening, who is noticing it, and why even women are now openly calling out the behaviors that push men away in the first place. Before we go any further, take a moment to like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more great Angry Guy content and want to get every single video the moment we release it. It helps the channel more than you realize, and it ensures you do not miss what is coming next. Also, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of the video. That is where I teach people how to protect and safeguard their assets and grow their wealth by learning how to buy, sell, and trade crypto in a responsible and structured way. If you care about your future, your independence, and your financial resilience, go check it out now. And if you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It keeps the lights on, the research flowing, and the content coming. Now, let us talk about what is actually happening. For years, the conversation around relationships, dating, and social dynamics has been framed in a very narrow way. Men were told what they needed to change, how they needed to behave, how they needed to apologize, and how they needed to constantly prove their worth. At the same time, expectations placed on men quietly increased, while expectations placed on women were often treated as optional, flexible, or negotiable. This imbalance did not appear overnight, and it was not created by one group alone, but it has reached a point where even women themselves are starting to say something is deeply wrong. What makes this moment different is not men speaking out. Men have been speaking out for years, only to be dismissed, ridiculed, or told that their experiences were invalid. What makes this moment different is women openly criticizing other women for behaviors that have made relationships unworkable, unsustainable, and emotionally exhausting. This is not about attacking women as a group. This is about naming patterns of behavior that have consequences, and those consequences are now being felt across society. Many women are now saying out loud what was previously whispered or ignored. They are saying that expecting a man to provide everything while offering little beyond presence is not equality. They are saying that dismissing men's concerns, while demanding emotional labor is not empowerment. They are saying that framing every interaction as a power struggle rather than a partnership has damaged trust. And most importantly, they are saying that these patterns did not push men to improve, they pushed men to leave. Men did not leave because they could not handle responsibility. Men left because responsibility without appreciation becomes obligation, and obligation without respect becomes a burden. Over time, men observed that no matter how much they gave, it was never enough, and no matter how much they adapted, the goalposts kept moving. Eventually, many men stopped trying to win a game that was designed to never end. For decades, men were told that their presence was replaceable, that they were not needed, and that their traditional roles were outdated or unnecessary. That message was repeated in media, education, and cultural commentary until it became background noise. What many did not anticipate was that men would take that message seriously. When someone is told repeatedly that they are not needed, eventually they believe it. And when they believe it, they stop offering themselves where they are not wanted. This is where the story shifts in a way that many people did not expect. Men walking away did not lead to chaos for men, it led to clarity. Many men discovered that being alone is not the same as feeling lonely. They discovered that peace is not found in constant validation, but in self acceptance. They learned to sit with themselves without distraction, without apology, and without the pressure to perform. In that space, many men found something they had not felt in a long time, which was calm. Meanwhile, the social structures that depended on men's constant participation began to strain. Dating markets changed. Expectations clashed with reality. Economic pressures increased. And suddenly, the absence of men was no longer theoretical, it was measurable. Fewer men were dating, fewer men were marrying, fewer men were initiating, fewer men were paying, fewer men were engaging. Not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. Some women began to notice that the script they were given did not prepare them for this outcome. They were told that independence meant freedom from men, not responsibility for themselves. They were told that standards were empowering without being taught the difference between standards and demands. They were told that men would always adapt, always pursue, and always return. What they are now realizing is that men adapted by opting out. This is not a story of winners and losers. It is a story of incentives and outcomes. When a system consistently penalizes participation and rewards withdrawal, people will withdraw. Men did not leave society out of spite. They left because the cost of participation exceeded the benefits. They left because they realized that their time, energy, and resources were finite, and that preserving them was not selfish, but necessary. There is a growing number of women who are now openly criticizing the culture that encouraged unrealistic expectations without accountability. They are calling out the idea that relationships should be transactional in one direction. They are questioning narratives that frame men as endlessly resilient while treating women as perpetually fragile. They are pointing out that mutual respect cannot exist where mutual responsibility is absent. This internal critique matters because it signals a recognition that something has gone wrong. It does not mean that all criticism of past social movements is fair or accurate, but it does mean that outcomes are being examined instead of slogans. When people begin to question outcomes, real conversations can finally begin. Men, for their part, have largely stopped trying to explain themselves. They are no longer arguing their case in comment sections or debates. They are voting with their feet, their wallets, and their silence. They are simplifying their lives, reducing unnecessary conflict, and focusing on what brings them fulfillment. For many, that means investing in health, hobbies, financial stability, and personal growth without the pressure to constantly justify those choices to anyone else. This shift has revealed something uncomfortable but important. Many systems relied on men's unspoken willingness to absorb stress, risk, and responsibility without recognition. When that willingness disappears, the system does not collapse overnight, but it does begin to wobble. That wobble is what we are seeing now in conversations about dating fatigue, economic strain, and social disconnect. Social media has amplified these tensions by rewarding outrage and oversimplification. Complex issues are reduced to slogans and nuances treated as weakness. In that environment, it becomes easier to assign blame than to examine causes. But reality does not respond to slogans. Reality responds to incentives, behavior, and consequences. Men trusted what they observed, not what they were told. They noticed patterns that repeated regardless of intention or explanation. They saw that promises of fairness often resulted in imbalance. They saw that emotional labor was expected of them, but not reciprocated. They saw that accountability was selective. Over time, those observations accumulated into a conclusion that could not be ignored. Walking away did not make men bitter. For many, it made them lighter. It removed the constant background noise of expectation and judgment. It allowed them to redefine success on their own terms. Instead of chasing approval, they began cultivating peace. Instead of proving worth, they began protecting it. This is where the misunderstanding often happens. Critics assume that men walking away are angry or resentful. In reality, most are simply done arguing, done negotiating, done explaining. They are not trying to change anyone's mind. They are simply choosing differently. Women who are now speaking out against certain behaviors are not doing so out of hostility toward women. They are doing so out of concern for the future. They see that a society built on antagonism cannot sustain connection. They see that treating relationships as power struggles erodes trust. They see that expecting effort without reciprocity leads to disengagement. Economic pressure has accelerated this realization. Hard times are here. Jobs are disappearing fast. And if you lose yours, you could be homeless in a few months or even a few weeks. But it doesn't have to be that way. Check out Angry's Creator Academy and learn how to build your own online business using YouTube to grow it. And get the free creator blueprint when you sign up. The link's in description below. Go check it out now. As life becomes more expensive, expectations that once seemed abstract now carry real consequences. When survival requires cooperation, ideologies that discourage cooperation begin to fail. Men, having already stepped back, are less affected by this shift because they have adjusted their lives accordingly. The reality is that men are not disappearing. They are simply redirecting their energy. They are investing in themselves rather than systems that no longer serve them. They are choosing solitude over stress, autonomy over obligation, and simplicity over spectacle. For many, this has resulted in a quality of life that feels sustainable for the first time in years. This does not mean that relationships are impossible or undesirable. It means that the terms under which men are willing to engage have changed. Mutual respect is no longer optional. Reciprocity is no longer negotiable. Peace is no longer something men are willing to sacrifice for appearances. The conversation we are seeing now among women is a response to this reality. It is an acknowledgement that certain narratives overshot their mark. That empowerment without responsibility creates imbalance. That freedom without accountability leads to isolation. That telling men they are unnecessary eventually leads to a world where they believe it. None of this requires hostility to understand. It requires honesty. It requires looking at outcomes instead of intentions. It requires recognizing that social dynamics are shaped by feedback loops, not ideals. When feedback is ignored, systems break. Men walking away is not a threat, it is a signal. It is a message written in absence rather than words. It says that peace matters, that boundaries matter, that participation must be voluntary to be meaningful. As we move forward, the question is not whether men will return. The question is whether the conditions that drove them away will be examined honestly. That is a harder conversation because it requires everyone to let go of comforting narratives and confront uncomfortable truths. What makes this moment so difficult for many people to process is that it challenges a belief that had become almost sacred. The belief was that social change only moves in one direction, that progress is automatic, and that consequences can be deferred indefinitely without cost. Men walking away disrupts that belief because it shows that social dynamics respond to pressure in real time. When pressure becomes unbearable, adaptation does not always look like compliance. Sometimes adaptation looks like withdrawal. For a long time, men were told that withdrawal was weakness, that stepping back was avoidance, that disengagement was failure. What many men discovered is that disengagement from unhealthy dynamics is not weakness at all. It is discernment. It is the recognition that energy is finite and that where you place it determines the quality of your life. Once that realization sets in, the need to argue disappears. The cultural narrative assumed that men would continue to absorb dissatisfaction without changing course. It assumed that men would keep showing up, paying, initiating, and apologizing no matter how the terms shifted. That assumption held for a while because men are conditioned to endure. But endurance has limits, and when those limits are reached, men do not explode, they exit. This is why the shift feels so quiet and yet so disruptive. There was no mass announcement, no unified movement, no centralized ideology, just millions of individual decisions made independently by men who looked at their lives and decided something was not adding up. That kind of shift is difficult to counter because it is not driven by persuasion, it is driven by lived experience. Women who are now speaking critically about certain behaviors are not doing so because they suddenly adopted a new ideology. They are doing so because they are observing outcomes they cannot ignore. They are seeing friends who cannot find partners. They are seeing dating pools shrink. They are seeing conversations repeat without resolution. And they are beginning to ask questions that were previously discouraged. One of the most important questions is this: if empowerment is supposed to increase happiness, why does so much of modern dating feel adversarial? That question cuts through layers of rhetoric and goes straight to the lived reality. Relationships built on suspicion, leverage, and scorekeeping do not create connection. They create fatigue. Men felt that fatigue long before it became visible. They felt it in the expectation to perform confidence while suppressing doubt. They felt it in the obligation to provide while being told they were replaceable. They felt it in being asked to open up emotionally, only to have that openness later used against them. Over time, many men learned that silence was safer than vulnerability. This is not about blaming women as individuals. It is about recognizing patterns that were normalized and even celebrated without considering long term effects. Social rewards were given for confrontation, not cooperation. Attention flowed to extremes, not balance. Over time, that shaped behavior in predictable ways. Men began to notice that conflict was not an anomaly, it was a feature. That drama was not accidental, it was incentivized. That peace was treated as boring, while chaos was treated as expressive. For men who value stability, this created a constant sense of misalignment. When men stepped away, they did not become inactive, they became selective. They redirected their focus toward areas where effort produced predictable results: fitness, skills, finances, hobbies, craftsmanship, solitude, and personal routines offered something relationships increasingly did not, which was consistency. Consistency builds trust, even when you are building it with yourself. Many men realized they trusted themselves more than they trusted social promises. That trust became the foundation of a new way of living. Less noise, fewer obligations, clearer boundaries. Critics often misinterpret this as avoidance of responsibility. In reality, many men are taking on responsibility for the first time in a way that feels voluntary rather than coerced. They are responsible for their health, responsible for their finances, responsible for their time, responsible for their emotional regulation. What they are no longer willing to do is take responsibility for other people's dissatisfaction. This distinction matters. Responsibility chosen freely strengthens a person. Responsibility imposed without respect drains them. Men walking away made that distinction and acted on it. There's also a generational aspect to this shift. Younger men watched older men navigate systems that often did not reward loyalty or sacrifice. They saw marriages dissolve with lasting financial consequences. They saw careers consume decades without offering security. They saw emotional labor go unrecognized, and they quietly took notes. When younger men choose not to repeat those patterns, it is not rebellion. It is risk management. It is pattern recognition. It is learning from observed outcomes rather than inherited expectations. The internet accelerated this process by allowing men to compare experiences across cultures and borders. What once felt like a personal failure was revealed as a widespread pattern. That realization removed shame and replaced it with clarity. When millions of people independently reach the same conclusion, it is worth examining why. Women who are now critical of other women's behavior are responding to that examination. They are saying that dismissing men's concerns did not make them disappear, it made men disappear. They are saying that slogans do not substitute for cooperation. They are saying that partnership requires effort from both sides, not moral leverage. This internal critique is uncomfortable because it challenges identity based narratives. It requires separating behavior from identity and accountability from accusation. That is a difficult shift, but it is necessary for any meaningful conversation to take place. Men, meanwhile, are largely indifferent to these debates, not because they do not care, but because they have already adapted. Their lives are structured around self sufficiency. They are no longer waiting for permission or validation. They are not seeking approval. They are not trying to be understood. They are simply living. This indifference is often mistaken for hostility. In reality, it is detachment. Detachment from outcomes they do not control. Detachment from narratives that do not reflect their experience. Detachment from systems that demand participation without offering fairness. The economic environment has reinforced this detachment. As costs rise and uncertainty increases, men are prioritizing stability. They are reducing liabilities. They are avoiding unnecessary entanglements. They are simplifying their needs. This minimalist approach is not about deprivation, it is about clarity. Men discovered that happiness does not require excess, it requires alignment, alignment between effort and reward, alignment between values and actions, alignment between expectations and reality. For many men, relationships stopped offering that alignment. The emotional cost outweighed the benefit. The uncertainty outweighed the comfort. The risk outweighed the reward. Walking away became a rational choice rather than an emotional reaction. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation have failed. Shame only works when people believe they are doing something wrong. Men walking away do not see themselves as wrong. They see themselves as finished with a chapter that no longer served them. And the more pressure is applied, the more men withdraw, not out of defiance, but out of self preservation. Pressure reinforces the very behaviors it is meant to correct. because it confirms men's assessment that engagement leads to stress. Women who recognize this dynamic are beginning to shift their approach. They are advocating for introspection rather than accusation, for cooperation rather than confrontation, for realism rather than idealism. Whether that shift becomes widespread remains to be seen. What is clear is that men are no longer waiting for change. They are not waiting for permission. They are not waiting for acknowledgement. They are building lives that make sense to them now, not hypothetically in the future. This has created a strange inversion. Men, once portrayed as resistant to change, have adapted quickly. Meanwhile, institutions and narratives built on their participation are struggling to adjust. That tension will continue to grow until it is addressed honestly. There's also an emotional component that is rarely discussed. Many men feel relief from constant evaluation, relief from walking on invisible lines, relief from being measured against shifting standards. That relief is powerful, and once experienced, it is difficult to give up. Peace becomes addictive when you have lived without it for a long time. Men who have found peace are reluctant to trade it for uncertainty, no matter how socially approved that uncertainty may be. This does not mean reconciliation is impossible. It means it cannot be forced. It must be earned through consistency, reciprocity, and respect. Men are watching actions, not words. They are responding to patterns, not promises. Women calling out other women is an early sign of this realization. It suggests that some understand the cost of ignoring feedback, that social dynamics are not governed by intention alone, that outcomes matter. Whether this leads to meaningful change depends on whether accountability becomes mutual rather than selective. Men are no longer interested in being the only ones who adjust. They are interested in environments where effort is met with effort and respect is met with respect. And if that environment does not exist, men are comfortable creating lives without it. That is the reality many are struggling to accept. The absence of men is not a threat, it is a consequence. Consequences are not moral judgments, they are signals. And the signal here is clear. When participation becomes too costly, people opt out. When opt out becomes widespread, systems must adapt or decay. Men walking away is not the end of society, it is a recalibration. Whether that recalibration leads to healthier dynamics or deeper division depends on whether lessons are learned or ignored. For now, men are choosing peace. They are choosing predictability. They are choosing themselves. That choice has reshaped dating, relationships, and social expectations in ways that cannot be undone by slogans or shaming. One of the reasons this shift feels unsettling to so many people is that it exposes how much modern social life depended on assumptions rather than agreements. For a long time, it was assumed that men would always pursue, always initiate, always compensate for imbalance, and always absorb dissatisfaction. These were not contracts that men signed. They were expectations quietly placed on them and reinforced through social pressure. When men stopped honoring assumptions that never benefited them, the entire structure began to wobble. What replaced those assumptions was not chaos, but choice. Choice is uncomfortable for systems built on predictability. When people can choose freely whether to engage or disengage, outcomes are no longer guaranteed. That uncertainty creates anxiety, especially for those who were told that certain results were inevitable. The idea that men would always be available was treated as a constant, not a variable. Men walking away turned that constant into a variable overnight. Many people still struggle to understand why men did not try harder to fix things. The answer is simple and rarely satisfying. Men tried for years. They adapted language. They adjusted behavior. They attended workshops, read books, followed rules that changed without warning, and attempted to meet expectations that were often contradictory. At some point, effort without progress stops feeling noble and starts feeling foolish. When men reached that point, the narrative labeled them as disengaged or emotionally unavailable. What was missed is that disengagement was the result, not the cause. Emotional availability requires trust. Trust requires consistency. When consistency disappears, availability follows it out the door. Men learned that expressing discomfort was risky. It could be reframed as weakness, insecurity, or entitlement. They learned that setting boundaries was often interpreted as hostility. Over time, many concluded that the safest boundary was distance. Distance could not be misinterpreted. Silence could not be used against them. This pattern repeated across countless individual experiences until it formed a collective shift. No single event triggered it. No single voice led it. It emerged organically from repeated exposure to the same outcomes. That is why it has been so difficult to stop or reverse. You cannot argue people out of lived experience. So women who are now openly criticizing other women are doing something that rarely happened before. They are acknowledging that certain behaviors produced predictable results and that dismissing feedback delayed necessary corrections. They are pointing out that empowerment narratives often encouraged entitlement without preparation. They are saying that independence without competence leads to frustration rather than fulfillment. These voices are often attacked because they threaten a comfortable illusion. The illusion is that outcomes are determined solely by intention, that if someone means well, results should follow automatically. Reality does not operate that way. Reality responds to behavior over time. Men responded to behavior they observed, not to slogans they were told to believe. They noticed that accountability was uneven. They noticed that apologies flowed in one direction. They noticed that sacrifice was expected but rarely reciprocated. Over time, these observations became impossible to ignore. One of the most revealing aspects of this shift is how quickly men adapted once they disengaged. Many expected men to spiral, isolate, or collapse emotionally. Instead, many men stabilized. They built routines. They invested in health. They simplified finances. They reduced unnecessary stress. They created lives that felt manageable. This outcome surprised those who believed men needed constant external validation to function. It turns out many men needed the opposite. They needed fewer demands and more autonomy. They needed space to exist without performance. Men found satisfaction in mastery rather than approval. They learned skills, refined crafts, and pursued interests without needing an audience. That kind of fulfillment is quiet but durable. It does not depend on constant affirmation. It grows through repetition and self trust. As men withdrew, some women experienced a sense of disorientation. They were not prepared for a world where attention was not guaranteed, where pursuit was not automatic, where provision was not assumed. That disorientation led to frustration, and frustration often looked for someone to blame. Blame was initially directed outward. Men were labeled avoidant, immature, or unwilling to commit, but those labels did not change behavior. They did not bring men back. They did not restore participation. Eventually, some women began to look inward and ask harder questions. Those questions are uncomfortable because they challenge narratives that were taught as unquestionable truths. They require acknowledging that incentives shape behavior, that people respond to costs and benefits whether they admit it or not. That moral framing does not override human psychology. Men walking away is not a rejection of connection. It is a rejection of imbalance. Men are not opposed to relationships. They are opposed to being treated as utilities rather than partners. When partnership is absent, disengagement becomes logical. The modern environment has also reduced the practical necessity of traditional relationships for men. Access to information, services, and communities has made self sufficiency more achievable. Men no longer need to tolerate dysfunction to meet basic needs. That reality has altered negotiating power in ways many did not anticipate. When people no longer need to participate, participation must offer genuine value. This is where many systems struggle. They relied on obligation rather than attraction, on pressure rather than incentive. Men walking away expose that weakness. Attempts to shame men back into participation misunderstand the nature of the shift. Shame assumes dependence. Men who have learned to thrive independently are immune to it. They are not seeking approval. They are not afraid of disapproval. They are focused on preserving stability. This is why messaging that frames men as missing out often falls flat. Men who are content do not feel deprived. They feel protected. They have measured the trade offs and made a decision. That decision is reinforced every time peace outweighs pressure. Women calling out toxic behaviors are often doing so because they recognize that hostility toward men did not produce empowerment. It produced isolation. It produced mistrust. It produced adversarial dynamics that drained everyone involved. These women are not asking men to return to old roles. They are asking for recalibration, for realism, for shared responsibility. Whether that message spreads widely enough remains uncertain. Men are not waiting to find out. They are continuing to build lives that do not depend on social approval. They are choosing predictability over passion, clarity over chaos, and peace over performance. This has implications beyond dating. It affects workplaces, communities, and social institutions. When a large portion of the population disengages, productivity patterns change, participation rates shift, cultural norms evolve. Men walking away from one area often leads them to invest more deeply in others. They mentor peers. They contribute to skill based communities. They build businesses. They pursue craftsmanship. These contributions are quieter, but no less valuable. The difference is that these contributions are voluntary. They are not extracted through guilt or expectation. They are given freely, which makes them more sustainable. A society that relies on unspoken sacrifices eventually runs out of people willing to make them. Men walking away is a sign that the reservoir of silent endurance was depleted. That depletion did not happen suddenly. It happened gradually over decades. Now that it has become visible, reactions range from denial to anger to reflection. Reflection is the only response that leads anywhere productive. Denial prolongs the problem. Anger hardens positions. Reflection creates space for adjustment. Men have already adjusted. They have done so quietly and individually. Whether broader systems adjust as well will determine what comes next. This moment is not about nostalgia for the past. It is about realism in the present. The past cannot be recreated, and many men do not want it recreated. They want something functional, fair, and sustainable. Fairness does not mean identical roles. It means balanced exchange. It means effort matched with effort, respect matched with respect, accountability matched with accountability. Men are no longer willing to negotiate these principles away for acceptance. They have learned that acceptance without respect is hollow. They have chosen self respect instead. Women who recognize this are not enemies of progress. They are often the first to notice when narratives stop matching reality. They understand that cooperation cannot be built on contempt. As economic pressures increase and uncertainty grows, these dynamics will intensify. People will gravitate toward arrangements that offer stability. Men have already made that shift. The silence many hear from men is not apathy, it is resolution. Resolution to live intentionally, to conserve energy, to invest where returns are predictable. Whether this leads to healthier relationships or deeper divides depends on whether lessons are learned. Men have learned theirs. They are acting accordingly. The absence of men from spaces that once took them for granted is a message that cannot be ignored forever. It does not demand attention. It simply persists. And persistence changes everything. Persistence has a way of revealing truth without argument. When men quietly remove themselves from spaces, expectations, and roles that once defined them, the silence that follows becomes louder than any protest ever could. People begin to notice patterns not because they are told to, but because the absence is felt in everyday life. Fewer conversations, fewer commitments, fewer men willing to negotiate their peace away for the sake of appearances. This is not rebellion, it is recalibration. What many observers fail to understand is that men walking away did not require coordination. It required clarity. Each man reached his conclusion independently, guided by experience rather than ideology. That is why there is no manifesto and no centralized leadership. The decision to step back came from repeated exposure to the same outcomes and the realization that continuing to engage would not change those outcomes. Men did not wake up one day and decide they no longer valued connection. They decided that connection without stability was unsustainable. They decided that intimacy without trust was unsafe. They decided that commitment without reciprocity was unwise. These decisions were not dramatic, they were practical. For years, men were told to communicate more, to be more emotionally open, to express vulnerability. Many tried. What they encountered instead of understanding was judgment, reinterpretation, or dismissal. Vulnerability was often reframed as inadequacy. Emotional honesty became ammunition rather than a bridge. Over time, men learned that self disclosure carried risks that outweighed the benefits. When men stopped sharing, it was described as emotional unavailability. What was missed is that emotional availability requires an environment where honesty is safe. Safety is built through consistency. When reactions are unpredictable, people protect themselves. This protective instinct is not unique to men, it is human. The difference is that men were discouraged from acknowledging it. They were told to push through discomfort for the sake of progress. Eventually, many realized that progress measured only in endurance was not progress at all. As men stepped away, they discovered that their lives became quieter but clearer. Without constant negotiation, decision making simplified. Without competing expectations, priorities sharpened. Without external pressure, identity stabilized. Many men experienced a sense of internal alignment they had not known before. This alignment did not come from withdrawal alone, it came from intention. Men began asking themselves what they actually wanted rather than what they were expected to want. The answers were often modest: health, autonomy, financial stability, time, peace. These goals did not require validation from others, they required discipline and focus. Men found satisfaction in routine and predictability. They built structures that supported their well being rather than undermined it. The cultural assumption that men need constant stimulation or approval to function was quietly disproven. Many men flourished in simplicity. They found meaning in self mastery rather than social status. That shift altered how they evaluated relationships. When relationships are assessed through the lens of cost versus benefit, the calculus changes. Men began asking whether engagement added clarity or confusion, stability or stress, growth or stagnation. In many cases, the answer was uncomfortable. Walking away did not eliminate desire for connection, it refined it. Men became selective. They were no longer willing to tolerate uncertainty in exchange for companionship. They preferred solitude to instability. This preference unsettled those who believed men would always choose proximity over peace. That belief was rooted in outdated assumptions about male dependency. Men demonstrated that dependency was not their default state, autonomy was. Women who began to question dominant narratives did so because they observed these changes firsthand. They saw men opting out without bitterness. They saw contentment replace frustration. They saw fewer arguments and more resolve. That observation challenged assumptions they had been taught to accept without question. These women are not rejecting progress. They are interrogating outcomes. They are asking whether the strategies promoted over the last several decades achieved their stated goals. They are noticing that empowerment, framed as opposition, created unintended consequences. Opposition can mobilize, but it cannot sustain. Sustaining relationships requires cooperation. Cooperation requires trust. Trust requires fairness. When fairness is absent, cooperation collapses. Men walking away exposed where fairness had eroded. It revealed where responsibility was unbalanced. It highlighted where empathy was selective. These revelations were uncomfortable because they disrupted moral certainty. Moral certainty is appealing because it simplifies complexity. It divides the world into right and wrong, heroes and villains. Real life does not operate that way. Real life is shaped by incentives, feedback, and adaptation. Men adapted to their environment. When the environment rewarded disengagement, disengagement became the rational choice. That choice was reinforced every time peace outweighed participation. As this pattern became widespread, attempts to reverse it through messaging failed. Messaging assumes that perception drives behavior. In this case, behavior drove perception. Men changed how they lived first, their worldview followed. This sequence matters. You cannot persuade someone to abandon a life that feels stable in favor of one that feels volatile. You cannot convince someone that chaos is connection when they have experienced the opposite. The growing discourse among women reflects a recognition that something fundamental shifted. They are grappling with the realization that men are no longer negotiating from a position of need. That realization changes everything. A negotiation requires leverage. For a long time, social leverage favored expectations placed on men. Men were told what was required of them. They were told what they owed. When men no longer needed the outcomes offered, that leverage dissolved. What remains is choice. Choice is destabilizing for systems built on obligation. It forces accountability. It requires mutual effort. It eliminates guarantees. Some view this as loss. Others view it as opportunity. Opportunity for relationships based on alignment rather than pressure. Opportunity for partnerships built on mutual respect rather than assumption. Men are not opposed to these possibilities. They are simply unwilling to gamble their peace on promises. They require evidence. They respond to patterns. This pattern recognition is not cynicism, it is learning. Men learned that words without action are meaningless, that intentions without follow through are irrelevant, that consistency matters more than declarations. As a result, men now watch quietly. They observe behavior over time. They assess outcomes. They decide whether engagement aligns with their values. If it does not, they disengage without drama. This calm disengagement is often misinterpreted as apathy. In reality, it is clarity. Men are clear about what they will tolerate and what they will not. That clarity came at the cost of years of confusion. Economic realities have reinforced this stance. As financial pressures increase, men are prioritizing security. They are reducing risk exposure. They are avoiding arrangements that could compromise stability. This is not fear, it is strategy. Strategy emerges when resources are limited, time, energy, and money are finite. Men learn to allocate them where returns are predictable. Relationships that introduce volatility without benefit are filtered out. This filtering process is ongoing. It does not require justification. Men do not announce their criteria, they simply act on them. Women who recognize this dynamic are adjusting their expectations. They are emphasizing cooperation. They are advocating for reciprocity. They are pushing back against narratives that frame men as adversaries. Whether these voices gain traction will depend on whether accountability becomes mutual. Men are not interested in being lectured, they are interested in being respected. Respect is demonstrated through behavior, it is shown in consistency, it is proven over time. Men are watching for that proof. The absence of men from certain spaces has created a vacuum. That vacuum is being filled by reflection, frustration, and in some cases, change. Change is slow because it requires letting go of comforting stories. Comforting stories tell people what they want to hear. Honest stories tell people what they need to confront. Men walking away is an honest story written in action rather than words. It does not demand agreement, it simply exists. It reshapes dynamics regardless of opinion. Those who ignore it will continue to struggle with outcomes they do not understand. Those who examine it may find opportunities to build something more balanced. Men are not returning to old roles. They are not interested in nostalgia. They are interested in functionality. They are open to new arrangements that respect autonomy and reciprocity. Until such arrangements are widespread, men will continue to prioritize self preservation. They will continue to choose peace. They will continue to disengage from environments that demand sacrifice without respect. This is not a threat, it is a boundary. Boundaries do not argue, they do not persuade, they simply exist. And when enough people establish boundaries at the same time, the world has no choice but to adjust. Adjustment is never immediate, especially when it challenges deeply held assumptions. Societies do not like to admit when a foundational belief has stopped working. They prefer to reinterpret outcomes rather than question premises. This is why the early response to men walking away focused on labeling rather than listening. Labels are easier than introspection. They allow people to preserve certainty while dismissing evidence. At first, men were described as disengaged because of fear, laziness, or immaturity. These explanations offered comfort because they implied the problem was temporary and fixable through pressure or persuasion. But as time passed and disengagement persisted, those explanations began to feel insufficient. Fear does not produce long term stability. Laziness does not lead to disciplined routines. Immaturity does not result in calm self direction. The reality on the ground contradicted the narrative. Men were not spiraling, they were stabilizing. They were not withdrawing from responsibility, they were redefining it. Responsibility was no longer about carrying the weight of expectations imposed by others. It was about managing their own lives with intention and care. This distinction unsettled many because it reframed responsibility as a personal choice rather than a social obligation. When responsibility becomes optional rather than assumed, systems built on silent compliance lose their foundation. Men did not reject responsibility altogether. They rejected responsibility without agency. They rejected being held accountable for outcomes they did not control. They rejected absorbing dissatisfaction without recourse. This rejection was not dramatic, it was procedural. Procedural changes accumulate quietly. One decision leads to another. One boundary reinforces the next. Over time, a new way of living solidifies. That is what happened here. As men stepped back, they discovered that many of the pressures they once considered normal were neither inevitable nor necessary. They realized that much of their stress came not from work or effort, but from navigating ambiguous expectations and emotional volatility. Removing those variables simplified life in ways they had not anticipated. This simplification did not require isolation. Men maintained friendships, professional relationships, and community involvement. What changed was the emotional cost associated with those interactions. Men began choosing environments where effort was rewarded predictably and boundaries were respected. This shift had ripple effects. Social spaces that relied on male participation felt emptier. Conversations felt one sided. Responsibilities went unclaimed. These absences were not dramatic enough to make headlines, but they were consistent enough to be noticed. Consistency is what gives absence power. A single departure can be ignored, thousands cannot. When patterns repeat across regions and cultures, they signal a systemic issue rather than individual failure. Women who began to speak critically about certain behaviors did so because they recognized these patterns. They saw that the same complaints were emerging across different social circles. They saw that advice given to women was not producing desired outcomes. They saw that repeating slogans did not restore engagement. This recognition created cognitive dissonance. The belief that men would always adapt clashed with the reality that men had adapted by leaving. Resolving that dissonance required re examining assumptions that had gone unchallenged for years. One of those assumptions was that men are motivated primarily by external validation. Many believed that social approval, romantic attention, or public recognition were necessary incentives for male participation. Men walking away revealed that internal alignment is a stronger motivator. When men aligned their actions with their values, external approval became optional. This shift reduced vulnerability to manipulation and pressure. It also reduced tolerance for inconsistency. Men began evaluating interactions not by how they felt in the moment, but by how they felt over time. Did engagement lead to clarity or confusion? Did it create stability or tension? Did it support growth or drain energy? These evaluations were not ideological. They were experiential. Men trusted patterns they observed repeatedly over narratives they were encouraged to adopt. This trust in observation over instruction is a significant cultural shift. It reflects a move away from abstract ideals toward practical outcomes. Men became less interested in what relationships were supposed to be and more interested in what they actually were. When reality diverged from expectation, men adjusted expectation rather than reality. That adjustment reduced frustration. It also reduced engagement with systems that could not meet revised criteria. This recalibration extended beyond dating into broader social interactions. Men became more selective about commitments, obligations, and causes. They prioritized sustainability over intensity. Intensity can feel meaningful, but it is difficult to maintain. Sustainability requires balance. Men discovered that balance was easier to achieve when fewer external demands competed for attention. This discovery challenged the narrative that men avoid introspection. In fact, many men engaged in deep reflection once they stepped away from constant negotiation. They had time to consider what they wanted their lives to look like without pressure to conform. What emerged was often a desire for simplicity, not because men lacked ambition, but because they recognized the cost of unnecessary complexity. Complexity without benefit was seen as a liability. Men began organizing their lives around essentials: health, income, skills, shelter, time, peace. Everything else was evaluated against these priorities, and relationships that supported these priorities were considered. Relationships that undermined them were avoided. This approach was not punitive, it was pragmatic. The idea that men owe participation to society lost its persuasive power. Men began to view participation as conditional rather than mandatory. Conditional on fairness, conditional on respect, conditional on reciprocity. This conditionality is what many found threatening. It removed certainty. It introduced accountability. It required systems to offer value rather than assume it. Women who recognized this were often labeled controversial because they challenged prevailing narratives. Yet their observations resonated because they matched lived experience. They were not arguing ideology, they were describing outcomes. Describing outcomes is harder to dismiss because outcomes persist regardless of opinion. Men did not return simply because they were criticized. They did not re engage because they were shamed. They continued living according to the structures they had built. These structures provided predictability. Predictability reduces anxiety. Anxiety reduction is a powerful incentive. Men were unlikely to abandon predictability for uncertainty. This reality forced a reconsideration of how relationships are framed. When relationships are presented as obligations rather than opportunities, disengagement becomes attractive. When they are framed as partnerships that enhance stability, engagement becomes possible. Men are not opposed to partnership, they are opposed to unpredictability masked as passion. They are opposed to emotional volatility framed as authenticity. They are opposed to imbalance framed as empowerment. The language used to describe relationships matters because it shapes expectations. For years, language emphasized entitlement rather than contribution. Men adjusted accordingly. As economic pressures increase, these dynamics intensify. Scarcity sharpens priorities. When resources are limited, tolerance for inefficiency decreases. Men became less willing to invest in arrangements with uncertain returns. This is not transactional thinking, it is strategic thinking. Strategy is not cold, it is deliberate, it considers consequences. Men learned to think strategically about their lives. Strategic thinking reduced impulsive engagement. It encouraged patience. It favored long term stability over short term validation. This patience is often mistaken for indifference. In reality, it is restraint. Restraint developed through experience. Men who had experienced repeated cycles of hope and disappointment learned to temper expectation. Tempered expectation reduces vulnerability. Reduced vulnerability increases resilience. Resilience allowed men to step back without resentment. They were not leaving to punish anyone, they were leaving to protect themselves. Protection is not aggression, it is boundary setting. Boundaries are neutral, they simply define limits. The widespread establishment of boundaries by men created friction because it disrupted existing norms. Norms rely on compliance. Boundaries resist it. When enough individuals resist norms simultaneously, norms must evolve or erode. That process is underway. Evolution requires adaptation from all sides. Men have already adapted. Whether others do will determine future dynamics. Men are not waiting for consensus, they are living according to conclusions already reached. That is why the shift feels irreversible. Irreversibility does not mean stagnation. It means the old model cannot be restored. New models may emerge, but they will be built on different assumptions. Those assumptions will likely include mutual accountability, predictable behavior, and respect for autonomy. Without these, participation will remain optional and rare. Men have demonstrated that they are comfortable with optional participation. That comfort changes negotiation dynamics fundamentally. The world is adjusting to this reality slowly. Some resist it, some deny it, some examine it. Examination is the only response that leads forward. Men walking away is not an ending, it is a transition. Transitions are uncomfortable because they require letting go of familiar structures. What replaces those structures remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: men will not return to arrangements that compromise their peace. Peace, once found, is not easily surrendered. Men are not offended by these conversations. Most are simply observing them from a distance. They are no longer invested in winning arguments or defending their experiences to people who have already decided what they believe. They are invested in maintaining equilibrium in their own lives. They do not need validation for choices that have improved their mental clarity, emotional stability, and overall sense of control. When peace becomes the baseline, conflict feels unnecessary rather than exciting. This is where many misunderstand the moment we are in. Men walking away is not driven by resentment, it is driven by resolution. Resentment is loud and unstable. Resolution is quiet and firm. Men did not leave because they wanted revenge or recognition. They left because continuing to participate no longer aligned with who they had become or who they wanted to be. For years, men were told to self improve, to focus on themselves, to build value, to become stronger, healthier, and more capable. Many listened, they trained, they worked, they learned, they disciplined themselves. What was not expected was that this self improvement would lead men to realize that many of the social arrangements they were told to desire were not worth the cost. Improvement did not make men more compliant, it made them more selective. Selectivity is often framed as entitlement when men exercise it, yet it is celebrated when others do the same. Men noticed this inconsistency. They noticed that choice was praised in theory but punished in practice when it came from them. Over time, they stopped seeking approval for exercising agency. They simply exercised it. Agency changes everything. When men realized they were allowed to choose solitude without shame, the leverage held over them dissolved. Fear of being alone had been one of the strongest tools used to keep men engaged in unhealthy dynamics. Once that fear disappeared, so did the power it carried. Many men discovered that solitude was not empty, it was restorative. It gave them space to think without interruption, to exist without performance, and to measure their lives by internal standards rather than external expectations. In that space, men found calm. Calm is difficult to give up once experienced. This calm is what critics often misinterpret as emotional coldness. In reality, it is emotional regulation. Men are no longer riding the highs and lows of constant validation and disappointment. They are grounded. Grounded people do not react easily. They do not chase unpredictability. They do not confuse intensity with meaning. As men step back, they gained a clearer view of how much emotional labor they had been performing without recognition. They had been managing moods, expectations, and conflicts that were not theirs to solve. Removing themselves from those roles freed up immense mental bandwidth. That bandwidth was redirected toward personal growth and stability. Stability became the new standard. Men asked whether something added stability or undermined it. If it undermined it, they declined. This approach simplified decisions that once felt complicated. It also reduced guilt because decisions were no longer framed as moral judgments, but as practical ones. This practical mindset spread quietly. Men shared observations rather than ideology. They compared notes rather than rallying cries. They saw the same patterns repeat across different lives. That shared recognition reinforced individual conclusions. When enough individuals reach the same conclusion independently, it becomes a cultural shift rather than a trend. The cultural shift we are seeing now is not anti relationship, it is anti imbalance. Men have not rejected connection. They have rejected arrangements where connection required self sacrifice without reciprocity. They have rejected environments where accountability flowed in only one direction. Women who are now speaking critically about these dynamics are often doing so because they feel the effects firsthand. They see fewer men engaging. They see less initiative. They see exhaustion replacing excitement. They see frustration replacing optimism. These are not abstract issues, they are lived realities. Some women respond to this with anger, others with denial, and others with reflection. Reflection is the only response that creates possibility. Reflection asks what behaviors produced these outcomes. Reflection acknowledges that incentives matter. Reflection accepts that choice cuts both ways. Men choosing not to participate is not an attack, it is a boundary. Boundaries are not punishments. They are declarations of limits. Limits are necessary for healthy interaction. Without limits, relationships become extraction rather than exchange. The discomfort many feel now comes from the loss of certainty. Certainty that men would always pursue, certainty that men would always provide, certainty that men would always adapt. When that certainty vanished, so did the leverage it created. What replaces certainty is negotiation. Negotiation requires mutual respect. It requires clear expectations. It requires accountability on both sides. Men are open to negotiation, but only under conditions that preserve their peace and autonomy. Peace has become non negotiable. Men who have tasted it understand its value. They are unwilling to return to environments that disrupt it. This is not stubbornness, it is wisdom gained through experience. As economic pressure increases and life becomes more demanding, this wisdom will spread rather than fade. Scarcity does not encourage sacrifice without return. It encourages efficiency, selectivity, and self preservation. Men have already adapted to this reality. Those who hope men will simply return out of nostalgia or guilt misunderstand the depth of the shift. This is not about the past, it is about alignment in the present. Men are building lives that make sense now, not lives based on promises of future fulfillment that may never arrive. The future of relationships will not be decided by arguments or trends. It will be decided by outcomes. Arrangements that offer stability, respect, and reciprocity will survive. Those that do not will continue to lose participation. Men walking away is not a movement with a leader or a manifesto. It is a pattern with a cause. The cause is imbalance. The effect is disengagement. Ignoring that equation will not change the result. Men are not asking to be convinced. They are not waiting to be called back. They are watching actions, not listening to words. They are evaluating behavior over time. They are choosing accordingly. Whether this leads to healthier dynamics or deeper divides depends on whether lessons are learned. Men have already learned theirs. They acted on them quietly, individually, and decisively. I want to know what you think about what was discussed here. Do you agree with it? Do you disagree? Or do you see parts of it playing out in your own life or the lives of people around you? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts and perspective because these conversations matter and they are not going away. Like the video if you like it, do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.